If your rental property isn't performing right now in Phoenix, it's probably not because the market is bad. It's because the strategy you chose doesn't match what actually is working in 2026. And this is where a lot of investors get stuck. They're still using 21 or 2022 expectations in a completely different market. Short-term rentals aren't printing money the way they used to. Mid-term rentals aren't some magic solution either. But one of these is clearly outperforming for certain types of investors right now, and it comes down to stability, income, consistency, and risk. So if you're trying to figure out whether you should go short-term or mid-term in Phoenix in 2026, this is what you actually need to understand. Let's start with short-term rentals because this is where most of the confusion still is. Short-term is not dead, but it's no longer forgiving. In 2026, Phoenix is a much more competitive short-term market. There are more listings, guests have higher expectations, and average properties are getting exposed. You can't just furnish a place, throw it on Airbnb, and expect it to perform. Now, when short-term works, it still works well. You can generate strong revenue during peak season. Events, snowbirds, tourism, that demand has not disappeared. And here's the shift. Income is inconsistent. And that inconsistency is what's hurting investors. You're not looking at steady monthly cash flow. You're looking at swings. Strong winter months followed by slower summers where you're adjusting pricing just to maintain occupancy. If your numbers only work in peak season, the deal is fragile. That's the reality of short terms in 2026. Now, let's talk about midterm rentals because this is where a lot of smart investors have been pivoting. Midterm rental demand in Phoenix is being driven by real, consistent needs. Travel nurses, insurance housing, corporate relocations. In 2026, those demand drivers are still here and they're not nearly as seasonal. So instead of chasing bookings every few days, you're locking in longer stays, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and that changes everything. Your income becomes more predictable, your vacancy risks drop, and your operational workload is significantly lower. You're not dealing with constant turnovers, constant cleanings, constant guest communication. Now the trade-off is real. You're probably not hitting the same peak monthly revenue as a high-performing short-term rental, but you're also not dealing with the same level of volatility. And for a lot of investors right now, that trade-off makes sense. So let's break this down clearly. In 2026, this is the real difference between short-term and mid-term in Phoenix. Short-term gives you higher income potential, but lower consistency. Mid-term gives you lower peaks, but much more stability. And the gap between those two matter more than it did a few years ago. Now, let's talk about risk because this is where a lot of decisions should actually be made. Short-term rental risk in 2026 is coming from a few places. First, competition. There's a lot of listings and guests have options. Second, seasonality. Phoenix demand still fluctuates heavily depending on the time of year. Third, your execution. If your pricing, design, or management isn't dialed in, your performance drops fast. And fourth, regulations and restrictions. Certain HOAs and areas are tightening and that risk hasn't gone away. So with short-term rentals, you're managing multiple variables at once. Mid-term rental risk is different. It's more about whether you can consistently source tenants, whether your property is set up correctly, and whether you understand the platforms and relationships needed to keep it occupied. But overall, it's a more controllable model. Less exposure to daily fluctuations, less dependence on seasonality. Now, here's what most investors get wrong. They choose the strategy first, instead of choosing the right property and matching the strategy to it. In 2026, that approach does not work anymore. You can't force a property to succeed as a short-term rental if it's not in the right location, doesn't stand out, or doesn't have the right demand drivers. And you can't assume every property will automatically work as a midterm rental either. The best investors right now are strategy flexible. They look at location, nearby demand drivers, price point, layout, regulations, and then decide what strategy gives them the best balance of income and stability. And this is where execution becomes a deciding factor, because two properties can look almost identical on paper, but perform completely different depending on how they're managed. We see this all the time. One owner is barely breaking even, another is generating consistent returns. Same market, same type of property, different setup, different strategy, different execution. So what's actually working in Phoenix in 2026? Short-term rental is working for highly intentional setups, good location, strong design, professional level management. If it's average, it struggles. Mid-term rental is working for investors who prioritize consistency and lower volatility, especially those who are scaling or who have already experienced the ups and downs of short-term rentals. So the real question you should be asking isn't which one makes more money. The question you should be asking is which one gives me the type of return and the level of risk I actually want to deal with, because those are two very different decisions. And if you're serious about buying a short-term or mid-term rental, you already own one in Phoenix and it's not performing the way you expected, I don't just hop on random calls. I want to understand your goals, your numbers, and what you're trying to build so I can give you real direction. So I put together a quick intake form. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out. Once you submit that, I'll review it, and if it makes sense, I'll reach out and we'll map out a strategy that actually fits your situation. Because in this market, it's not just about owning a property. It's about choosing the right strategy and executing it in the right way.